Are officially live on Building in Public, and today we have Christina Cacioppo joining us from Vanta. Did I
Thank
get
you
that
so much
right?
for having me. Close enough. Yes, that was good.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining. I knew your name because I don't know if you recall, but we actually took a walk and
Remember
had
this?
tea many
Yeah.
years ago, and I wanted to look up where that came from, and that was through Chloe Slayton.
Oh,
She was the one who
this
connected
was
us.
yeah, and this was late 2016 when we were not working on Vanta. We were like, what were we
Right.
doing?
Wow,
Yeah.
Yeah.
cool.
It
Yep.
was a long time ago. And I don't know if you were you ever connected to Rohan Seth around that time?
I think so. Yes.
So, because
Yeah.
Rohan and I were running a thing called Request for Comment, which was like people
Uh-huh.
who were thinking about new startup ideas would come together
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah. I know we
kind of
talked about
like
this.
pitch startup ideas to each other, and everybody kind of react to it. And so
Yeah.
we were just kind of like getting a bunch of people together, and Chloe was
Right. Oh,
in
now that you say this.
in a group
Uh-huh.
because I think she came to talk about some stuff she was excited about. Actually, I may have missed some of the details here, but my recollection is that Chloe had come to an RFC, a request for comment, to
Yeah.
discuss the startup idea, and then she said, "Oh, if you're, next time you do this, you should get Christina here."
Oh my God.
And then I think we didn't
Amazing.
do a next one. I think we only did one ever.
One, but I do actually, now that you say this, I do remember you talking about this, and I was probably like, yeah, we don't, there's this voice AI stuff we're playing around with, but nothing's very
Hmm.
promising. We're mostly just confused. Yeah. Yep.
Wow. Wait, so what was going on then in 2016? Like, is this when you were sort of like playing with a bunch of ideas with
Yeah.
people who would end up founding Vanta with you? Or like,
Yes,
yeah, what was going on in
exactly.
your head at that point?
Yeah, in retrospect, I mean, I say we kind of knew we were confused at the time, but we did not. We were pretty set on trying to start a company, and I think we'd all separately built things in the past that no one wanted, so we're pretty scared of doing that again. Like the Field of Dreams, build it and they will come was like, at least I don't know, old or grizzled enough to have tried that and realized
Yeah.
like, God, Evan Spiegel and like Mark Zuckerberg pulled that off, and like kind of no one else. And so we're trying to figure out things. And I think one of our brainstorming prompts, which was somewhat helpful and somewhat not, it's hard to tell in retrospect, but was like, what's different now? Right? What's changing about the world? What can you do in late 2016 that you can't otherwise? And one of the fields of things we were looking at were like AI tools, because when like TensorFlow had just come out and like a bunch of the new voice models. And so it was like, okay, this stuff is all new. What can we do? And I can't remember, but at some point that fall and early in 2017, we were building voice assistants for biologists, which I think has this very coherent first principles narrative about how you would get there. But then when you also kind of wake up and you're like, wait, I've never been a biologist. I don't even know what a biology lab is. Like, why am I building a voice assistant for biologists? Like, whatever, like founder product fit here, like poor. Anyway, and so yeah, I do remember this like kind of confused time, and we sort of knew we were confused. So.
Mhm. And did you, at the time, looking back? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Misty.
Oh no, you go ahead. I was just gonna say I had shared with DK this like awesome list of things you built earlier, and definitely want to ask you about that. And like teaching yourself how to code. There's so much here. But DK, go for your question first.
I mean, but the kind of the macro point of that list is, I mean, certainly not to show off because everything on that's kind of crap, but it's just to like make the point that like it's the quote at the top that is cliche, but I also believe in, right? Like I don't know, at least for me, right? Like have to make a lot of stuff to figure out what good looks like and how it's different from, again, first principles. This idea hangs together and then you make it and you're like, what in the heck am I doing? And I think there's a lot, the stories that get told again are the like, Mark Zuckerberg went into a dorm room and emerged with the website that 12 billion people use, even though there's not 12 billion people on the planet, And the stories that don't get told are like those lists. And so, yeah, I just do have a like kind of a macro plot of like more publicizing of these things so that this stuff seems more accessible to more people.
I love that philosophy. I feel like part of the reason that we like doing what we're doing here is making videos. Is we sometimes get people who are like really early. I mean, you're much further along with the actual product and customers, and you know what you're building. Sometimes we get people who are not really far along, and they're kind of like a little bit in that brainstorm mode and trying to figure it out. And what, I think one of our goals would be we fast forward a few years and we've seen something that looked raw and uncertain, and now everybody just accepts it as truth and it's huge and interesting. And we can actually look back and see what raw and early and unformed looked like, directly from somebody's kind of own narrative. So that's one of the, I mean, it will take a long time probably for that to play out, but I think it's similar, similar motivation, I think, that we have in that. So this list of products,
I love stuff like this. I mean, just briefly, like the best, I was trying to think of like metaphors for this a few years ago, but like the artist's like atelier, right? Which sounds fancy, but it's basically like the artist's workshop. You're like, where are all the bad paintings before you made the good one? And being able to go like walk through that and sort of see the, progression there. I think it's just like so confidence inspiring, actually.
Yeah. Totally. And I'm actually curious, like, the very first one on here is like Foursquare venue search engine, and then you've done everything from like prettier iPhone address book. Like, there's just so much on here. And what delighted you throughout this process and like made you want to keep playing around with these new ideas? Because I think a lot of people get either stifled before they start. They're like, oh, I need to think of something so amazing that like so many people will use it, and then they don't even end up making anything at all. Or they make something and they're like, well, that was a waste of time. And then like they don't push themselves to build up this list of like 50 things before they. So like, what was it, the right people around you, or kind of what kept your energy going throughout this?
The people really helped. So one piece of advice I got from someone I'm close to still, which was really good, was a little demoralizing at the time when I got it, actually, but it was really good, which was basically like, you're learning so quickly that you should actually cycle through projects quickly, because your code one day is just so much better than your code even 2 or 3 weeks later. And so you should just scrap the old, like be really aggressive at scrapping the old things and starting over again. So you don't get kind of locked in the morass. And at the time, I think I was like a little offended, honestly. I was like, I'm getting better, and I can save things, and I'm good at whatever, all that. But it was actually just really good advice. And I think that's true both, at least, or it's true for me, both on the engineering side, like the coding side, where like I just like learned to set up each additional project slightly better. I'm not amazing at it to this day by any means, but incrementally got better. But then also on like the product building side, right? Of just, you like, one of the things on there that's on there like 4 or 5 times is a book website. I just could keep making book websites. And now it's a bit of a trope and sort of fun, and it's sort of my go-to thing. But they're all substantially different because you kind of can take the learnings and keep going versus trying to rescue an old project. So that was really helpful advice, actually.
Yeah. And did you have a certain process that would help you decide when to start something new or when to end it? Or did that itself, the startings and the endings, evolve over time?
Yeah, it took me a bit of time. But so I can be really stubborn. This is useful and not, for all the obvious reasons, right? Like, not unique to me, just unique to stubborn people. And one particular manifestation of that is, again, once I've like started making something, you're like, no, I'm going to get it to work. Like, I'm good enough. I'm going to work hard enough. I'm going to whatever. And sometimes it's the right answer and sometimes it's not. And so, but at any moment in time, if you ask me if I should keep working on something, I would be like headstrong, like, of course I should. I will get it. And so what I ended up doing was every week I would ask myself, I would send these questions to myself, like the Google form. And there was a bunch of questions, but a bunch of it wasn't helpful. The most useful part was, what are you working on? And why do you like it? And what would make you stop working on it? And the stop working on it was actually really helpful because, like, again, in the moment, I'd always want to keep going, but I could also at least be like, oh, my prior self, thinks I should have stopped when A, B, and C happened. A, B, and C just happened. Do I know more, or like, am I just being stubborn? And so that ended up being really helpful for me. Because again, in the moment, I'd always want to keep going, but I could also kind of realize that I was being a bit goofy sometimes.
That's cool. So then what did that look like when you decided to like double down on this idea that you're working on right now? Like, did you have a couple rounds of those where you were like, is this it? Is this it? Like,
yeah.
What was the process of deciding?
Yeah. So if we go back to like late 2016, we were like taking park walks talking about like voice assistants for biologists, like confused land, and then so Vanta in its current form was really like March through maybe September. The first code was written in September of 2017, but the March period started with really early investigation into security broadly and security at startups, which you can talk to. But anyway, there was just this March through September period where, it went from conversations to like spreadsheet prototypes to free consulting to eventually code. But there's this long process through that. And I think there were two questions that were really helpful through that. One, which wasn't actually that helpful for me, was, do I like working on this? Which I think some of the project lists, you can see I like working on lots of things. I like learning new things to a fault. So like send me down a rabbit hole and I'm like, woo, great, learning new stuff down a rabbit hole. Feel good, like happy with how I spend my time. So that wasn't a great question for me, but because I'll like always say yes. But the second question actually which was, how do you feel about recruiting someone to work on this thing? Because that's the place where I can be like, ooh, I enjoy diving down rabbit holes. But like someone else has a career in kids, should I pull them down the rabbit hole? Can I actually do that? And, for a while, the answer was like, no, do not stay at Dropbox. Like, do not go down the rabbit hole. Who knows what's down here? And then eventually getting to a point where you're like, oh, yeah, this could actually be something, right? Like, it'll take a lot to get there, but like, yeah, this is kind of like a worthwhile boondoggle. So those were the two questions.
And what was that like where you kind of went from not knowing to knowing? Like, what were they like customer discussions, or were they like, prototype building, or kind of some feedback? Like, what did that look like?
Yeah. So a little bit of column A, B, and C. So practically, the first early conversations were just with security people and CTOs. And it started with this macro hypothesis of security on the internet is really important. It's increasingly important. And this is like 2016, 2017. So we got like the 2016 election and everyone's emails. We've got Equifax, right? You're like, okay, all this stuff is going on. We keep saying it's really important. And then we keep kind of doing this goofy stuff where where you're like, and you just didn't update your database for whatever 6 months, Equifax, and and you're like, this is hard, but not. And like, what's the discrepancy? So then you're just being like, I don't know, it's a curious thing. Let me go ask people about it. And learning that, security is hard in a lot of ways, but one of the primary ways it's hard, especially for small companies, is just incentives, right? Like, it's not that the CTO doesn't know that the databases aren't quite set up well. They probably know, and they probably feel badly, but then they come into work and are like, okay, I can go fix that thing, which, may or may not have an impact, or I can go build the feature that the customer wants to close. Right? And it's like this prioritization is actually the hard thing with getting security prioritized. So then you're like, okay, well, shoot, how do you solve that? And this is actually where we came across compliance again, where in a good sense, compliance is when your customer asks you for the security features, and this stuff gets prioritized. And so if we can use compliance, for the security end, and this is where, the joke that's not a joke about Vanta is that if you want to start a security company, you should start a compliance company. But like why we actually believe that is how you get it prioritized. Anyway, so it was that journey. And when we kind of got to that was very first principles-y. And then it was like, okay, cool. Well, like, what is compliance? Can we actually automate it? What does that look like? And would people want it? And we did some initial kind of asking around, but the rubber really met the road when we started doing free consulting for our friends' startups, where we'd come in and say like, hey, we know a lot about SOC 2, I think, let's make a gap assessment for you. Like, we'll make you a crazy color-coded spreadsheet of everything you need to do. And we were trying to test a few things. One, would they let us do it? Two, could we actually do it? And then again, like, feel good about ourselves that it wasn't like snake oil or like made up off of, too much random Googling. And then 3, was it actually useful to them? So we did that for the first company. They actually really liked it. And which was like, great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Moved to a second company. And then it was like, okay, can we use our old spreadsheet and just like the format, right? And just change the information. Like, can we like kind of sort of copy paste the format and the instructions? And that worked. And then like the other light bulb was we actually got an email from an old Dropbox colleague. Then that was really funny. The email was basically like, hey, heard you guys became SOC 2 consultants. Super weird decision. We should probably get drinks. But can you do it for my startup too? Right? And that's where we're like, no, but we will start coding. Thank you. And also let's get drinks, but that was probably the closest to like, okay, if we can do this, people will want it, and we think we can do it. Now, I mean, we sort of knew this at the time. Like, writing code against that spreadsheet took us 2.5 years to like actually do, and in some ways we're still doing that. But that was the validation that it was like, okay, this is a thing that, again, we're getting random emails about.
And so it's like the free consulting.
But halfway to get it. Yeah.
So it sounds like the free consulting was a way for both you to learn about the problem, but also for you to like kind of do some early customer development without needing the heft of actually like having a price point or having a product.
Yeah, exactly. We did the price point stuff and some of the product stuff like 6 months later, which I can talk to. But yeah, at the time it was just like, we're going to take your engineers' time to interview them for this. Will you give us that?
And did they kind of already know they had the problem when you were talking to the first folks? Were you kind of explaining that they probably had the problem and they were like, oh, really? Oh, interesting. Or were they kind of like, oh, we have this problem. You're going to solve this?
Yeah, they sort of knew. So this is one of these things that's changed over the past few years. But at the time, they knew what SOC 2 was. They knew they would need it at some point for enterprise deals. And it was just a question of like, well, when do we actually spend time figuring out what that is? And, that's when we came in and we're like, we'll figure it out for you. Right.
I see.
So.
Right. And then we haven't actually talked that much about the details of what is SOC 2 compliance, but can we get like at least the TLDR. Couple of sentences, TLDR on it?
Yeah. So really high level, like, a SOC 2 is an audit that a third party comes in, they check your security practices, they sign off on them. And then you as a company have, this artifact that is practically a PDF, that you can use it and say like, hey, big company, I know you're worried about, giving me your data because I'm a random startup and you don't know if you can trust me, but you can trust me, and you can trust me because one, I was like thorough and rigorous to go through this crazy process. And then second, right, like I have this letter that a, auditor signed off on and said I'm in good shape. So it ends up, it's sort of this, proof or demonstration of your security practices done by a third party that gets used in sales cycles for B2B startups.
I see. And it's mostly when a company is fairly immature that they don't have a process that they need this kind of audit to convince customers. Is that kind of the pattern?
Ish. So it's funny because when we were raising the seed round 3 years ago, the biggest pushback we got was only big companies need this. Startups don't need this. Like, what are you doing? And so like big companies have sort of always needed it, and they have established ways that are sort of terrible to get it. The startup piece is actually more new, and that's just as, and then again, this was actually the first principle stuff that very much made sense, was like, look, we just are going to be increasingly concerned about the security of our software vendors. SOC 2 is our default way to think about it today. Whether it's good or bad, who knows? But it's the default. And so there will be more SOC 2s in the future, not less. And this was, basically our seed pitch in a nutshell. And yeah, a very reasonable pushback was like, what are you talking about? None of the startups in my portfolio have this. So.
Right. And so it sounds like the growth of maybe the SaaS companies, the kind of the team companies is also part of the tailwinds for what you're building with SOC 2 compliance?
Yeah, very much so. And the other part, and I don't know how well understood this is, but the SOC 2 standard changed this was just luck. So the SOC 2 standard changed in late 2018 and became more recursive. So it's basically like if you have a SOC 2, your vendor, you should probably make sure your vendors have SOC 2. And so this is the other way it got to startups, is it just got pushed down the chain there.
Right.
And that was sort of implicit prior to then, and it became much more explicit then. So that was also tremendously helpful.
I see. And so it sounds like when you started this, you were functioning as a consultant to learn about the problem. And my guess is like, there's actually people who probably run consulting businesses doing this kind of thing.
It's true. Yeah.
but my guess is you're wanting to build as much repeatable technology as possible and not kind of be in the consulting business world. So is that sort of a fair picture of what the landscape looks like today?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the innovations, and I mean, I kind of say this in quotes because it's what it is, but I feel a little goofy saying it, right? But one of the things that Vanta did was go previously, it was like every company's SOC 2 looks different. Step one is to like look deep inside your heart and think about what security practices you want, and then like, you know, right? But like no two SOC 2s look the same. And we looked at that as engineers and software people, and we're like, look, some customization, cool, but also like the security practices, you know, of, I don't know, Dropbox shouldn't be that different from the security practices of like Airtable, right? Like there's just some best practices stuff in here. And so our innovation was being like, hey, we're going to standardize this thing, and then we can allow customization on the edges. But like everyone start with these 100 things. And so we made this list of 100 things that we thought, you know, mapped to a SOC 2 and that brought in like engineering or security best practices, and we're like, start here. Forget the vision quest. Like just work off the list. And that model has resonated with startups, but also resonated with auditors in the market. And I think there's just a lot to recommend it. So not to say there's, you know, no place for consultants. I can talk about, there's absolutely a place for them, but that product decision ended up being a good one.
Right. And so it sounds like auditors, do you spend a lot of time then kind of coaching auditors into how you see the world to get them on board with your own kind of view of how this stuff should be done?
Yeah, exactly. And it's, I mean, they're open to it, right? Because like kind of their names are a bit on the line too, and they want these customers to have good security posture too. And the other thing we've learned, right, and this is, you know, obvious to us in startups, but like the technology here changes so quickly. And so even something now like container scanning is actually the thing where we're like often, we do a lot of education of auditors around that because it's new to them. Most of their, you know, non-startups aren't using containers. All the startups are, what are the security implications of this? Just like stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah. And I saw that you had expanded into different areas as well, like HIPAA stuff with healthcare, and just kind of curious about how you're thinking as a team. How do you think about like prioritization and what feels like top of mind right now? Is it like, let's go really deep into the SOC 2 stuff, exploring these other areas, or what are the conversations like as a company?
Prioritization is the hardest and most important thing. So to that end, so we do, and now we actually literally have this graphic on our website, but we think about Vanta as like, okay, here's a security monitoring platform. We'll monitor your company's security in a bunch of ways. And then that's the foundation. And like, you can't go do the standard stuff without it. And then once you're in reasonable shape, we'll help you prove your security with a SOC 2, with a HIPAA, with a PCI, with a, you know, alphabet soup. And so those are sort of layers on top of what we do. And so the standard piece, and so that actually also just product wise and customer experience wise forces us to try to generalize and like simplify and make, you know, comparisons across the standards. So it's not a bunch of repetitive work. So just, product development wise, like we have the security monitoring foundation and then standards on top. And a lot of the work we've done this year in 2021 so far was going from a product that had SOC 2 coded into it on every level, implicitly and explicitly, to something where we can like kind of swap different standards in and out and make it easy for us from a development perspective to add additional standards, so that we can just kind of roll a bunch of those out.
And are these kinds of standards, I'm trying to kind of get a better kind of tactile feel. It's like, is it something like you've got a bunch of different, maybe it's like a, you know, AWS instances of a database of like a user table, and then you're going to take like some customer data and import it. And these things may run in containers, and so you want the Vanta system to be able to kind of watch all of the transactions that happen in that container and make sure that things don't leak out, or there's some port scanning thing, or like what does it actually look like?
Yeah, for sure. So some of that. So first analogy, and then I'll go to specifics. So the analogy we talk about with Vanta is like, we are the thing that makes sure, your company has a house. And we make sure all your doors and windows are locked, right? And in some ways it's no more, no less than that, right? It is not like some security companies will do the equivalent of saying, hey, we have this super fancy front door that like not even China can get through, right? And we're like, you got your wooden front door. Just make sure you lock it. Actually, because again, if you go back to like the DNC and Equifax and Sony and all this stuff are two things. One, a lot of these breaches happen because you left the front door open.
Yeah.
And then I think the second part, and this is going to sound a little fast and loose, but I think there's something there, is like, look, if China is going after your startup, congratulations, you have made it, right? Like for most startups, their issue is not China wants to hack them. For most startups, their issue is like their customers don't trust them enough. And so, we're very focused on that. So that is like an overall metaphor. So what that actually means is, so for something like AWS or GCP or like cloud infrastructure, so we pull configuration information. So it's not like what's in your database. Like we don't want that. You don't want to give that to us. Like, what we want to know is like, how is your database set up? Like, is it encrypted at rest? Who can log in? What are those permissions? Like, what are those accounts like? What employees are tied to those accounts? Kind of things like that. Storage buckets. Do you have any that are open to the public, Uber style, that shouldn't be, right? Whatever it is. And so we integrate with it's a bunch of different tools, not just cloud infrastructure. But broadly, it's checking how things are set up. And then on our side too, and we go all the way from the like HR system, down to these tools. And so it is like, David joined the company in this role and has this access, and maybe he left. And does he not have the access? And trying to like reason horizontally like that.
And so you have like a bunch of integration points with the actual like technical infrastructure that's operating a thing, but then also you're talking about sort of like the roles. So you have something of like, are people using like, I don't know, Okta or whatever? What are the typical ones that people use, like these single sign-on solutions for an enterprise? You have to take that and add like a new layer of information to that around kind of the structures for SOC compliance.
Yeah, because there's a all the role-based access stuff, right? So you're like, well, if your recruiter has access to AWS, like maybe there is a reason for that, but like it is worth flagging and being like, hello, is this on purpose, right? And someone could say like, yes, be quiet, I'm good over here. But just being able to do that full chain of reasoning.
And what is the typical like size of a company when they first realize that like their customers are asking them for this? Are they like a couple people in a garage, or is it like a dozen or 2 dozen or?
Yeah, it's small, right? And again, this was the thing we went around and told everyone for the seed round, but it's actually happened. So the biggest, so generally, like 20 or under. The other added level on that is like, what industry or who are your customers? And so we have to me at least, a surprising number of like 2 founders on a couch sort of companies. And they tend to be fintech companies, and they tend to need a bank relationship to launch. And so my canonical example here is Modern Treasury, because we worked with them when they were 3 founders, and they're great. And they just needed a bank relationship to launch their treasury product. The bank wouldn't talk to them without a SOC 2, so they got a SOC 2 with 3 people. And they've been doing it ever since. So the small ones tend to be like that. And then I think on the larger side are like the, kind of Notions of the world that have a like bottoms up, land and expand. They've actually gotten quite large before they get on somebody's IT person's radar, who's like, we have so much data in this thing. Like, can we go figure out what's going on over there, and should we trust them? So those like team collaboration, bottoms up companies tend to be a bit later.
And then do you have to go to like those larger companies that are bottoms up, land and expand? Do you go to them kind of with some sort of like documentation to explain sort of how the Vanta system works, or are they coming to you with like a bunch of asks and?
Yeah, like how do we sell? More inbound, majority inbound. And the outbound we've done historically, and this is changing a bit just as we mature and grow, but the outbound historically has been around SOC 2. So sort of, hello, do you know you need one of these things even if you don't know what they are? Because we're the best way to get them and we love to teach people about them. Like, want to chat? Again, it's more structured than that, but that's like roughly what the outbound looks like. And then the inbound is, I mean, I joke about this, but it's people coming, and it's usually an engineering leader who has been tasked with getting a SOC 2, doesn't really know what the thing is. And so they come to us and they're like, hey, I got to get one of these by Q4. I don't know what it is. So can you tell me that? Also, how much does it cost? Also, why do you have a llama on your website? Thank you. You know, like joking, but like those are kind of our first conversations.
Did you answer the llama question early or late?
Usually pretty early. Yeah.
That is awesome. I want to hear that answer. And then I also want to hear about kind of your learnings, like as Vanta has been growing a lot. And I saw that you have a ton of positions open for hiring too. So you could tell us about what you're looking for. But yeah, what's it been like kind of maturing with this company and team as it's grown, and like internally thinking about like how do you do decision making? Is it group calls with like 3 people and now the company is huge? Like take us through that process a little bit too.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do llama first. So I mean, I was joking on Twitter the other day, but it's true. Like the llama is one of the best things we've ever done as a company. So this was when we were like 8 people in an office, you know, I don't know, spring of 2019. And we were doing our website for the first time, wanted animals, and vehemently did not want guard dogs, because every security company mascot, if it's an animal, we're like too basic. So one of our engineers goes down the like Wikipedia rabbit hole and like emerges with llamas that are historically used to guard things because they are super territorial and they spit. And then we sent llamas off to an illustrator, and the first llama that came back is the dot llama. He's not officially online anymore. You can go find him. It was just the best, and we all fell in love with him and have become llama/alpaca people ever since. So like all the llama puns, like when you join Vanta, I think actually you have to hit 1 year at Vanta and we'll mail you a llama, you know, like there's just a lot of stuff.
Oh my God. That's amazing.
I never pulling up screen share it so we can look at it. Yeah. Security monitoring platform. What's the difference between a llama and alpaca?
Oh, so I don't know, but people, God, don't put this part on Twitter. The people who do know will like, you can tell based on the illustrations. I can't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Hopefully llamas are more territorial than alpacas.
Yeah.
Alpacas are noticeably smaller. So yeah, I think you picked the right one.
Yeah.
More
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Okay, so when scaling and growth.
Yeah.
Okay,
like team, company growth.
Bit of context and background. So let's see, 2019 we started with the year with 5 people, ended at about 15. 2020 was 15 to 45, so it's mostly COVID, and this year 45, and we're at 70 now, you know, and 100 or so, and so it's been a ride. You know, every day, the joke is like every day is a new day at Vanta and every week is a new day at Vanta. And right, both been in high growth environments, and there's a deep truth to that, and there is good and painful things, but it is like so true. You're like, what will happen today? Definitely not what happened yesterday. And so I think part and parcel of that, right, is well, a fewfold. One of like calling out that like all of these problems are champagne problems, right? And you're like, we have too many customers, like we just have too much stuff to do, right? And you're like, yes, no one's going to cry for us, like we just like it's both hard and worth calling that out and good. And so I think like that macro take overall. I think part of it too, and one thing that I'm like still working on is believing that the growth will happen. And by that, I mean, I'm like deeply long Vanta, you know, all of the things. But I also think, you know, I'm getting a little better, but if you come to me and are like, hey, Vanta is going to be at, 110 people in 6 months. And so you need to like fix your all hands now. I'll sort of be like, no, we won't. Like, what do you mean? That can't actually happen. And that was exactly very much me last year. Right. And so just like trying to rewire that in myself and then also other people. And part of that is the upfront planning. But honestly, I think part of it is normalizing process changes, right? And just being like, it is not a bad thing when we blow up the way sales hands off customers to CSM or whatever, right? Like, we're just going to blow that up every 4 months. And that doesn't mean you failed or your team is failing or whatever. It means that like, woo, we got too many customers. Okay, moving on, right? And so that cultural piece too, I think is really important because it is so easy to feel like what you're doing isn't good enough again when things are growing quickly. And
what's your process of identifying like I'm just going to ask like what the process is for identifying the areas you want to dig into and maybe like take a fresh look at. I mean, I'm sure a lot just pop up all the time organically, but like week to week, how do you bring some sanity to your mind and routine when you're like going through this stuff?
A few fold. So one, I have a team of folks at Vanta who are also very good and also jump on lots of things. So it is like, 0% I do all of it. Like I do probably less than my share in probably a lot of ways. And so that is extraordinarily helpful. The other part for me more personally is I sort of have figured out like I get so we set OKRs as a company and we set OKRs in part for the accountability, but also for the communication and the like, these are the things we are going to do this quarter. And like something could come up, but for the most part, if it is not in, not in this scope, it shall be like, thanks so much, reevaluate Q3. And so for my own OKRs, I roughly have two, one around exec recruiting and there's particular roles, which is pretty standard for this stage. And then the other one is like a special project, right? And you're like, and I get one special project. And again, I'm a bit of a shiny object person. So that frame for me has just been really helpful. Whereas like Q1s was the financing, like Q2s is actually values and employee onboarding, right? And other stuff is going to come up, but I am not going to do it because I will not do any of it well if I take on really more than one special project.
And the special project is kind of a quarter by quarter defined thing. And how do you figure out like what to define as the special project? Is that something that just is obvious to you from a bunch of hallway conversations? Is it something you discussed with like investors or board members? Or how do you think about setting that?
Yeah, so hallway conversations, and I think, what that looks like in a COVID area is office hours, right? Which I do kind of very regularly with folks. And they will come and be like, hey, no one actually quite says it this way, but, they should come and be like, hey, our onboarding was last looked at last June. It's kind of goofy now. And you're like, yep, pretty goofy, in one-on-ones with, folks. So much more of that sense. But usually, I mean, there's always multiple things, but usually there is one, like the onboarding values one was one that was pretty obvious.
Yeah. And what are you like personally trying to like work on learning the most right now? Whether it's like leadership, personality stuff, or like specific domains you're digging deep on? Because you seem like such a curious mind and like constantly learning new things. I was really curious to ask that.
Yeah, for sure. Exec recruiting, I feel like this is a very founder answer, right? But just, officially working with executive recruiting firms, which are actually wonderful ways to learn how to do it, right? And you have to kind of figure out, match their style with yours and, not take everything verbatim, but that is very much a work in progress. Alad Gill actually, pre-COVID, like February of 2020, told me to start building a leadership team. And I was like, well, that's hilarious. Like, again, Vanta's 20 people. What do you mean? And then when I, put my head up 6 or 7 months later, you were like, oh, I should have taken that advice. That was good advice. So I feel like I'm a little late to the game on that one. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, but another, again, big one right now is around the values and culture and onboarding. You're like, how do other companies do this, right? The Amazon Work Backwards just came out that coalesced a lot of things. There's, a few other versions of that book for other companies, but also just going and talking to other founders and, figuring out how they did some of this stuff. And from that, our word for Vanta, this is book reports, right? You like sort of make a book report where you go, do all the research, and then you come out with like your point of view on the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how does do you ever work with any like formal relationships and like maybe like an external coaching type of relationship? Because you mentioned briefly about trying to transition your views from kind of maybe it's the very early raw things to now you're sort of like building a system and you kind of know what it is and you kind of have more execution. So I wonder, like, how does that shift work, and do you have like specific support that helps?
I do. This is also advice I got a year and a half ago, where I was talking to a colleague, Gary Chow from USV, and he was sort of like, you have no support system. Like, what are you doing over there? And we know each other well enough where you could sort of say that. And it's sort of like, oh, reasonable point there. So there's actually, there's a bunch of folks, but there's two in particular who I spend about an hour a week with separately. They're very different personalities, who generally have the same advice, but one person comes at it as, and love him deeply, like brash New Yorker, right? Like, like, Christina, you're getting, steamrolled. Like, just go tell him to screw himself. Whatever, right? Yeah. Fire them now, whatever, whatever that advice is. And then the other person is much more like, we bring our whole selves to work, right? You see the person for who they are. And then you politely part ways with them, or whatever it is. Right. And not that everything's about, we actually don't, let go of people very often at all. I don't mean to make it all about that, but just as that's an easy example of these two people who are, again, so different and will actually triangulate to the same advice. And I find that really helpful, is having that back and forth too.
Mm-hmm. So that, I think like, it sounds like a lot of those kinds of decisions, you're getting different perspectives on, synthesizing it, kind of making it your own and bringing that energy to the company. And so I wonder if you were to describe to somebody who's just, maybe curious about Vanta or learning about maybe it's a role or a job opportunity there, like, what does it feel like to work at Vanta?
Yeah. Hopefully good. No, we have an incredibly empathetic group of folks who are also one of our values, we're going to keep, this one is just true. Like, and the values are, uncovered more than created. Like, we couldn't get rid of this one even if we wanted, but the growth mindset piece, right, is very core. And so I think it ends up being a pretty curious place where, like, yes, there's a lot of things going on, and again, things flying left and right, but also a place where it's kind of, encouraged, or very much encouraged, to work cross-functionally, to use the big words, and the other words are just like, go chat with customer marketing and be like, what even do those words mean? Like, what do you do, right? And they'll be like, I do these things, and like, what do you do? And like, can we work together? And like, da-da-da-da-da. So there's just like a lot of chatter like that, that I think is, sometimes when things get hectic, like some of that falls by the wayside, but actually not that much, because I think we just hire for it and cultivate it so much that it's pretty foundational.
So do you have like a list of kind of core values or these kinds of processes that would express some of those, like, we're a chatty, curious culture? Is that there something like that?
Yeah. So the current, I think this will get tweaked on the edges, but pretty foundational. So 4 values, I'll go through them. 2 are startup standard, kind of generic, but they're good. 2 are Vanta specific. Oh yeah, they are now on the website. So the 2 kind of more generic ones are ownership and impact. Again, sort of every startup's values, but that's because they are just so useful and so good and such things to encourage. The other 2 that are more Vanta specific are 1, growth mindset. And so this is the curious growth mindset. Like, you may or may not know how to do the thing you're being asked to do, but it's cool. You can figure it out and we'll help you. And like, we got you. And like, you're a person who can do this. Don't worry. And then the last one is frameworks thinking. So they think probably the most controversial. And And this is basically like, hey, when you're thinking through a decision and articulating it to others, explain what it is, right? My classic example is, if you want to change, the llama to, I don't know, a cat, right? Like maybe we should, but if you come in and be like, the llama should be a cat, everyone is going to look at you funny and be like, what are you talking about? If you come in and you're like, hey guys, I've been thinking about the llama. I think we should actually move to a cat. Here's like the 3 things I thought about. Here's the test I ran. Here's the data. Like compared to the, company mission and vision, like we should really be cat people over here. That might actually work, and that will resonate much more. And so casting decisions with a framework has been just really important.
Cool. Makes sense. I think were we juggling? Okay, we're juggling with screen share a little bit. By the way, did that show up for you, Christina?
No, it didn't.
You? Okay, you saw it.
Yeah. Going, assuming it would.
Yeah, that's okay.
Do you see it normally again, or I think I canceled it? Do you just see the normal view of the 3 of us, or is it black?
No, I see a black square.
I see a black square, and then I think I can get it back. So we can debug this later. But I think we've got an idea of what that is. But we're playing with some new features today. So
yeah,
thanks for playing along.
Yeah.
On the I think other stuff on the team side, like what does the structure of the team look like today in terms of eng, product, sales, how is that evolving? Customer service, you mentioned. How does that evolve kind of from where you are today, and what does that look like in the future?
Yeah. This is a good Excel system, a LOD tip that I only halfway followed, but was draw out your org chart for 9 months from now and then go execute against it, which I drew and then didn't execute against it. So I missed most of the tip, but I think it was actually a really good one. I also drew a totally flat org structure because you're like, I don't know what it's supposed to look like, which should have been a tip. But anyway, so where we are today is we have, kind of roughly 2 halves, right? Like eng, product and design, EPD together, like pretty closely coupled. And then the go-to-market side, sales, customer experience, which covers success and support, but like putting those folks next to each other so they can talk about the people they're serving. Yep. So sales, success, and marketing there. And then finance and recruiting are sort of in their own, like G&A bubble, but a little more independent / cross-functional given those roles. Yeah.
And you mentioned that you grew, I think, was it 12 to 45 during COVID?
Yeah.
So was that all done? Was that all done kind of like in a distributed nature, or are you centralized but over Zoom or something for now, or how does that look?
Oh, yeah. So we'll see when this meets the reality of folks coming back to the office, but we are committed to having an office, and we do have an office in San Francisco and Hayes Valley filled with llamas. We are committed to opening a space in New York City. I don't know if it'll be maybe something in WeWork, but like something there. And if you are near one of those places, like, you are welcome in. Otherwise, we started at hiring more distributed on some teams. So actually, particularly on the go-to-market side. So sales, success, support are more distributed. We got comfortable with that because we had to, right, over COVID, but actually now are very comfortable, educating, ramping, managing reps or whomever over Zoom. So that part feels good. On the engine product side, still a preference to have folks in an office when that is a thing that happens.
And that'll be for either the SF office in Hayes Valley or New York, but you'd kind of have to, if you're an eng who lives somewhere else, say Texas, you'd encourage somebody to move to one of the hubs.
Yeah, and we do that early in the recruiting process, where if you're in Texas, we'll be like, hello, do you want to be in one of these places? Because we don't want to have like you all, on your Texas island, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess it sounds like the kind of chatty nature of the culture may be one of the driving forces there. Is that primary, or is there something else kind of going through your head there?
It's primarily that. There is, an interesting bit of the folks who worked at Vanta pre-COVID, right? Like signed up to work at an in-person company and did not sign up to work at a, remote company. And right, like there are a minority and things change, but there's actually something that is very, very deeply true about that, right? So a lot of this is like they're sort of reserving the right to, reevaluate pretty consistently. But my guess is end product and design will be more co-located. The go-to-market side will be more distributed.
Right. And will that be will that be like 5 weekdays a week in the office, or is it kind of a hybrid thing where you can come in 3 times if you like, or?
Yeah, it'll probably be pretty. So as a general rule, and some of this we get away with size, but also some of it's kind of culture is like. So we actually haven't even talked about that one yet. My guess is it'll be the point of view we try to take with this stuff is you're an adult, like you do you, right? And there are some things we'll ask for, but mostly we'll ask for results. And so look, if you want to, if you can get your job done, and right, where some of that is cross-functional work or in-person work, and you can, do that, right? And that is infinitely more important than commuting to Hayes Valley 5 times a week or whatever. So.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for you, would you pick 5 days a week, probably in office, or?
I've been doing 3 days a week in office, just for the past few weeks. And it's like strange and funny, right? After a year of, Zooms from the bedroom, basically. But yeah, I'd probably do like 4 or 5.
Cool.
I've missed working with people more than I expected, for sure. Like I've kind of deeply missed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's totally reasonable. Yeah. No, it's nice to get a little bit of the blend of like serendipity back as well. I'm sure you're feeling that.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask, I love your book blog posts and like all of the book side projects. And I wanted to ask what you're reading these days and what you found like inspiring and interesting. It doesn't have to be about tech at all, but it could be if that is piquing your interest.
Yeah. So in undergrad, for most of undergrad, thought I wanted to be a development economist, and particularly when focused on East Africa. So I spent a few summers on East Africa, and so it's been a long-standing interest. And one of my favorite authors, who's a journalist who spent a bunch of time in the region, just wrote a book about Rwanda. So the book is called Do Not Disturb. The author is Michaela Wrong. And I loved it. I've, again, long admired her writing. It's her 4th or 5th book, I think. And Rwanda was the first place I went to. So kind of holds, it's just like meaningful. Yeah. And it was, anyway, in reading that, it came out about a month ago. So like, pre-ordered it, got it the day it came out, was like, supporting Michaela, sent me down all of these, like, I went and reread all my old emails and all this stuff from like being in Rwanda a decade and a half ago. And it was a really fun weekend. So.
Wow. Yeah, that looks really great.
Yeah.
I saw that you posted, had you posted a reading list? Yeah, Reading Africa, this list that you retweeted, I saw as well. It was pretty interesting. I mean, that was a while ago, so probably from earlier, but yeah, I'm going to share that in chat too.
I know there's a lot of talk about Africa as kind of a frontier in a sense of like new energy in the world. And I think there's certainly, people looking at it as there's just so much energy that's maybe not connected to the rest of the world. And I wonder, broadly, how does your interest in Africa evolve, or sort of what are sort of the trends or things that people should be paying attention to related to the continent?
Oh, yeah. I mean, broad question. But I think one of the things that I came away strongly believing is just like how important infrastructure is. And so by that, I mean, my first summer in Rwanda was 2005. And then this was before CCOM, before the undersea cable from, I think, like, the Gulf got connected over to Kenya. And so the internet was just like ungodly slow, right? It was like, I was back to like, 2000 or 1996 dial up, and seeing the difference between, I think, like 08, 09, by the time at least like Rwanda got wired all the way through, was super transformative. Similarly, M-Pesa, the Kenyan mobile money system, where you're sending money or airtime back and forth, right? Like, kind of saw the before and after there, and saw that project go from a like Vodafone is doing this nice corporate social responsibility initiative, and like, are they doing good in the world, to like, oh my God, every Kenyan uses this, right? And there's more, Kenyans on it proportionally than, use Facebook. And then also seeing the other African countries and the banks start moving to regulate this and say telecoms can't operate banks anyway. So that's, that piece. The other infrastructure piece, and I've talked to a friend about this, but yeah, if I were to, I don't know, go back and fund something, roads, just like road quality, is just in some places so poor. And so it just takes forever and makes it really expensive to, ship things from like Mombasa, the Kenyan coast inland. And in some ways it's so easy. Like, why can't you just pave the roads? And of course, all of these issues are more complicated than that. But just huge believer in like core infrastructure. And then to your point, right? Like, there's a lot of engaged people who want to go do things and create things. And so if you can just like take away some of these literal roadblocks, like they'll go do their thing. That's great.
Right.
That's kind of the easy part in a way, if you just like unlock that.
Right. Yeah. I know a lot of times, and actually I noticed we're nearing the end, so I want to make sure we wrap on time. But I noticed a lot of times on this point you were making on Africa is people talk about analogies of places that don't have infrastructure, and then they end up being able to adopt a new technology for infrastructure and sort of get to skip some of the existing systems that we have. Yeah, the leapfrogging. So is that kind of thing, is there any promise that kind of stuff is already happening in Africa broadly? And is that kind of a major trend, or is it still we got to get the basics in terms of like roads? I think maybe they've done it in mobile phones, but just kind of like transportation infrastructure needs to be a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of both, right? Like transportation infrastructure, like as much as, I don't know, I live in like a world of bits, like atoms are still very important. The leapfrogging is interesting, like M-Pesa, like most Kenyans, well, actually, I don't know, more Kenyans have M-Pesa accounts than they have bank accounts, right? And that was like a wonderful leapfrog, but to sort of, be one of those tech people who complain about regulation for a moment, like what actually happened was, again, especially in West Africa, like Nigeria, Ghana, the banks saw what was happening and, basically got laws passed that said you cannot, transfer money as a telecom. And so when you go look over in West Africa, the population's much less banked, or if you count M-Pesa as a bank. So maybe to try to TLDR this, like, yes, I think there's tremendous potential for leapfrogging. Also gotta let the frogs leap. Like, cannot regulate them out of the leapings.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. Cool. Well, I know we're past time already. This has been super fun for us to kind of catch up and hear about the Vanta story. And I mean, so much of your entrepreneurial story and energy came through in this discussion. So I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Made my day.
Okay.
All right.
See you, Christina.
Yeah. Bye.
Thanks for spending time.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay.
Made my day.
Okay.
All right. See ya.
See you, Christina.
Bye.